Welcome everyone. Welcome to this special web series on decolonizing international aid. It's an honor to be your host today. My name is Kisa Magendane and I work in The Hague as a knowledge broker, a knowledge brokering organization connecting research, policy, and practice. By organizing a series of dialogue on decolonization of aid, one automatically assume that the current development and humanitarian interventions are colonial. To what extent is that the case? And how does a decolonial development or humanitarian agenda looks like? What is the responsibility of organizations or individuals within those organizations in the attempt to build a decolonial humanitarian and development agenda? To answer these questions, this series of the webinar is organized by KUNO, Partos, and the International Institute of Social Studies in order to inspire development and humanitarian professionals to critically reflect about their field. And listening to one another is a very important aspect of this process. This dialogue on decolonization of international aid will be conducted in a series of webinars, each focusing on a specific perspective. Today, we start with the historic perspective. We invited two historians who will give us an historical analysis of decolonization of international aid. The following webinars will subsequently focus on development perspective, the humanitarian perspective, and the donor perspective. And then before I invite my speakers, I want to end with these questions. When we speak about international aid, one wonder who is actually aiding who? And about decolonization, who is decolonizing? Who need to be decolonized? Is decolonization some technocratic interventions that one can realize by using buzzwords such as diversity, inclusion, and localization? Or is decolonization more a process that asks an honest and vulnerable reflection of all the parties involved? Could we all become winners in a decolonization process, or do some need to feel the pain and lose something in order to build a decolonial development agenda? What is actually the difference between people working in the development and those working in the humanitarian sector? Could one make a separation, a nexus in these two fields? And are the people, the development, the humanitarian professional different from people working in the private sector? Or are they also part of the political and economic reality that shape our world order? Today and the coming webinar, we hope to find some answers to these and other tough questions and be inspired to take a decolonial approach in our work. Before I introduce the two speakers of today, I'd like to start with Thea Hilhorst, who will be my partner in crime in all these series. Thea Hilhorst is a professor of humanitarian studies at the Institute of Social Studies, related to the Erasmus University in Amsterdam. She is based in The Hague. Her work focuses on conflict-affected settings and the impact of humanitarian interventions to the targeted communities. Thea, welcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kisa.
How
nice
excited are you about this series?
Very much so. I really admire KUNO, the organizing committee, that they have taken up this issue that I know many people feel very passionate about. Sometimes people feel maybe threatened by the discussion. Others look forward to it and really see it as an opportunity to change the relations of aid. And others again, and one of the issues, of course, we need to look into is like, what was the original idea of humanitarian assistance? And that's why I'm so glad we start with a historical overview, like the idea of giving dignified aid to people who are in need, and how is that going to be affected, and how is that going to be different if we imagine an aid system that is decolonized? What does it look like? I very much like what you're saying, Kisa, that perhaps it's more, it's about relations, it's about power. It's not about properties of people, like I have to decolonize and you have to decolonize. Yes, of course, it is about our mindset, but very much it is about our relationships, the power we have. And by the end of the day, it is about the relationship we have and can develop with the affected communities and the people who participate in humanitarian programs. So I'm really excited, and I'm so happy that there are 6 of these seminars. So this is just the start. So today we feel very legitimate to end the seminar with loads of questions and very few answers. And then we can feel comfortable knowing that we will get together again another 3, 4 times, 5 times, maybe even more. So that's going to be wonderful. I really look forward.
Exactly, because decolonization is at the end ongoing process. So maybe Thea, could you give us an understanding of why? Because you say it should start with understanding the raison d'être. Why is actually humanitarian or development work so relevant? And today we started with an historic perspective. Why is that important? And maybe what would you expect from the 2 experts today? What do you hope to learn?
Well, I love a historical perspective to these questions. Oh, if only because it is just amazing to see how some of the discussions are rapidly changing, and some of the realities and the truth that we had in humanitarian aid for perhaps 150 years are now all put in the question. And it's my firm belief that if we don't understand where the discussions come from, it's also very difficult to have the discussion as to how we are evolving today. And I think the historical discussions give us some anchors to hold on to when we discuss what humanitarianism is today.
Yes, I hope that we learn together there, and you will be involved in the conversation by both looking at what people are asking and contributing in the chat, and also to give us some reflections of learned lessons of today, and maybe some message and further questions for the next series. Without further ado, I would like to go to my next speaker and introduce my first speaker, who is Arua Oko Omaka, who he's an historian, specialist of war and society. He's a teacher at the Department of History and Strategic Studies at the Alex Ekwueme University in Nigeria, Ebonyi State. And his research interests include African history, humanitarianism, human rights, and transnational justice. The Library Journal Review listed his book on the Biafran humanitarian crisis as one of the bestseller in African history in 2017. So Arua, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours. Please give us some understanding on the historic perspective of decolonizing international aid.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be with you today, and I think it's a privilege and honor. I must thank the organizers of this important dialogue. It's a very interesting topic. When we talk about humanitarianism, as an African, I will look back to Africa and then provide a perspective, to this concept, humanitarianism. From the colonial era to the present, Europeans and Americans' relationships with Africa have been concretized in terms of humanitarianism. And there's a historical root to this. When you look at humanitarianism, you go back to, the period of the slave trade and the abolition of the slave trade. When the idea of, abolishing slave trade came up, there was a kind of coincidence, a kind of evangelical revivalism that was going on in Europe and North America. And then this idea of abolishing slave trade came. And then, although there are other factors, but from this perspective, the humanitarian perspective, the question of abolishing, slavery and slave trade came up, and then the British took the lead and then, launched anti-slavery movements, at the West African coast, and then ensured that, every form of slave trade movement ended. And then this was in the 19th century. So this happened before the imperial engagement. So after the abolition of the slave trade, then came the conquest. So the idea of conquest was also presented in terms of humanitarianism. Africa was conceived as a continent of darkness, backward, savage, and so on and so forth. And there was this need to liberate, the need to save, to salvage people who were considered backward, benighted, and so on and so forth. And so the idea of conquest, colonial rule, was presented not necessarily in terms of economic adventure or profit-making business, but as a humanitarian venture. There was need to penetrate Africa. There was need to liberate Africa. And so when we talk about colonial conquest, you see that nexus between humanitarianism as as the ground for the conquest of Africa, and then what followed immediately after that. So the idea of colonial conquest was presented in that light, and with the conquest, came also the missionary activities, because within that period, as I said, there was evangelical revivalism that was going on in Europe and North America. And so people came from North America and Europe to Africa to present the good news, to bring whatever that came with Christianity, Western education, Christianity, Medicare, and so on and so forth. These were some of the things that came with the colonial conquest and missionary activities. And so these activities, education, medical care, and Christianity itself, were as this important. And so it came, and it was, I consider important in this missionary activity. The churches that, the Christian missionary groups that established their presence in Africa, achieved a lot, within this period by, evangelizing and then establishing their presence. And so, when the Nigeria-Biafra war broke out, it was this same group of people who sent the message across to Europe and North America that something, was going on in Africa, and there was need, to provide assistance, aid, relief for these people in Biafra, so that, they wouldn't all die as a result of hunger. And so the connection, there's this connection between what was established during the colonial period, and then what later happened in terms of aid in Biafra, because it was that foundation, that colonial foundation, that led to the, the huge humanitarian intervention that came during the conflict. Without that, colonial presence in form of missionaries and, their activities, it could have been difficult for Biafra to get the kind of aid it got during the war. And when you talk about the joint church aid, which I worked on in my book, it's essentially, when you look at the background, it was the missionaries who worked in Eastern Nigeria that broke away and formed Biafra, that, sent the message across to, different parts of the world, the priests, and, other church groups, Catholic, Presbyterian, and so on and so forth. They were the people that championed the cause of, the humanitarian activity that Biafra received. So there's that nexus between, the colonial activity in Nigeria, in Africa, Biafra particularly, and then the humanitarian aid that occurred. And when you talk about the humanitarian aid in Biafra, it is very, very important because at the end of the war, other humanitarian organizations emerged, because when you look at Doctors Without Borders, for instance, it's a product of that, humanitarian activity in Biafra, and so many other humanitarian organizations that emerged, after the war. But the important thing is that there's a connection between the colonial activity, the colonial rule in Nigeria, and the humanitarian aid that Biafra received, through the missionaries that operated in Eastern Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Arua. I guess that was the conclusion, this nexus between the colonial activities and the humanitarians organization or institutions. Could you maybe give us an image, because I forgot to mention this. For every speaker, we wonder whether you have an image that symbolizes the message that you just shared with us. A symbol that characterizes how the international aid structure at this moment is constructed.
How the current international aid structure
is characterized. Do you have like an image or symbol that would catch the message that you just shared with us?
Oh, well, I will present something, but I have a couple of things in mind. Just a minute.
Okay. In the meantime, I'm wondering whether I should introduce my next speaker. Or Thea, would you maybe want to reflect on, oh, there, Alex is there, but Thea, could you maybe reflect on this nexus that Arua just mentioned?
I thought it was very insightful. I mean, there is the nexus specifically around Biafra. And one of the things that I find very interesting about the work of Arua, that he works out that these were the missionaries and the priests, which are in fact very different type of people than we imagine when we think of the independent humanitarians of the Red Cross. But in the case of Biafra, it were those people that had a very long history in the country, with the country, and really wanted to and identified as well with Biafra. So at the same time, the links with colonialism are very clear. And what I find very striking is that what you're saying, Arua, that the language used to colonize Africa is not very different from the language used by humanitarians to go out and help people and save them and salvage them. So there's a very uneasy continuation in history where you think, okay, is the language the same or are even the intentions the same? So, well, I'm sure that is something we will talk about and come back to in the series. Yeah.
Yeah. So Arua, in the meantime, a very short, the image that you wanted to share with us.
Yeah. You see, the image I have is the image you are familiar with. And you see, what is going on today? What is going on today is, something, you have poverty, you have diseases going on in different places. And each time, it is presented, there's this feeling of common shared humanity across, the globe. People think, oh, because we belong to a family, the human family, in the name of, humanity, we have to respond. So this picture of people, in impoverished, people who are suffering as a result of hunger, diseases, people who are, affected by conflicts and other kinds of, natural disaster, keep, receiving attention based on what is presented, in terms of image. Okay, so it has not changed. I think it is still striking. It still provokes that feeling of, shared humanity, that emotion they need to respond to people who are suffering, in terms of disease or poverty, whatever. So that's, image is still, what is driving humanitarian intervention, up till today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arua. I hope that we reflect later, especially on this notion of shared humanity. And I know that Professor Bertrand Taithe will also share that from a historic perspective. For people who just joined us, welcome to this webinar on decolonizing international aid, organized by KUNO, Partos, and the International Institute of Social Studies. We just have listened to our first speaker, who shared us with a very focus on the Biafran context, the relationship between the imperial or colonial projects and humanitarianism. Now I'm about to introduce the next speaker. After that, we'll have a short reflection with both Arua and Bertrand. And there's also room for an interaction with the audience. So you are encouraged to share your questions or comments in the chat. There is a possibility to, Thea will be having a look. And there is even a possibility to let you speak. We have Peter on the microphone who will give you the floor. For now, I would like to introduce Professor Bertrand Taithe. It's French. I don't know whether I pronounce it well. He's a professor of history who has been working in the on humanitarianism in the past 25 years, also with NGOs, including Médecins Sans Frontières and Save the Children. He also edits the Journal for Humanitarian Affairs. This is a very brief summary of his long established essay. Bertrand, welcome. Please enlighten us.
Oh, well, that's thank you, Kisa. That's a bit much to ask from. Thank you, Arua. Can I just do a plug for Arua and I had the pleasure to take part in a roundtable on the anniversary of the end of the war in Biafra. This roundtable is, I'm very happy with that roundtable. I think it's an interesting exchange of views between a batch of scholars. If you're interested, you'll find it. It's open access. It's in the Journal of Humanitarian Affairs. So I'd like to complement a lot of what Arua said, because I don't have anything to contradict him. But the first point I'd like to make is, of course, a very basic point, which is that the colonial experience is possibly one of the most widely shared experience worldwide, in a sense that if we actually ask what post-colonial or decolonial means in South America or in Africa or in Asia, you will find, of course, very different, or North Africa, in North America, you will find different responses and different political contexts. But colonization as a political experience is one that has been shared for better or worse, mostly, well, in many instances for worse, in most parts of the world, from Greenland all the way to the Southern Hemisphere. So that's a simple point to make, because I think when we talk about colonial relationships, we may be in danger of replicating some of the colonial prejudices themselves. And I want to express what I mean by that. The first point to make is that there were colonial treatments in Europe as well as outside of Europe. So, for example, when the Irish joined in particular in response to the Biafra, there was to a large extent that that solidarity was based on what they perceived to be a shared experience of colonialism. And I think that's, so it's kind of significant that we shouldn't create false binaries north-south. There are much more complicated stories going on. So that's a very basic point to make. The second point I'd like to make is that humanitarianism has complex origins. And Arua has pointed out that the anti-slavery origins of humanitarianism. We could also bring forward a conservative form of humanitarianism, one that's been very well studied by my colleague Alan Lester, which relates to colonial administration, a sort of humanitarianism of colonialism found, for example, very explicitly in the British Empire in the 19th century and affecting dramatically places like Australasia. So Australia, New Zealand in particular. You could also think in terms of humanitarianism that has relationships with human rights. And of course, there is a complexity and a tension there, because as an ideology, and this is again Alan Lester's point, but I think it's an important one, as an ideology, humanitarianism originally may have been a more conservative ideology, and human rights a more revolutionary ideology. More conservative in the sense that it isn't about amelioration or a meliorist approach to situations, sometimes intolerable situations, rather than a revolutionary approach, a radical shift of politics. And that's something you find expressed again in different ways, but in the colonial setting creates, if you want, a tension. So in other words, you could actually have colonial governance and an explicit humanitarian message, which we may deem to see as hypocritical, but and it has different terms, different approaches linked to it. Well, one of them is a mission civilisatrice that the French Third Republic banded about to justify its colonial, some of its colonial endeavors. The poem of Rudyard Kipling is often mentioned, The White Man's Burden, which celebrated the arrival of the United States as a colonial power in its war against Spain. So bizarrely, in the act of dismantling the oldest colonial empire, building itself a new one. You have all these dimensions that actually were there in the colonial empire, and we have some significant figures of humanitarianism whose profile and attitudes to race, for example, are very challenging to our modern sensibilities. So one of the classic examples, the most famous humanitarian of the 20th century, Dr. Schweitzer in Africa, a theologian, doctor, and of course, pianist, who actually raised money through his piano concertos, and at the same time built a hospital in Lambaréné, could simultaneously devote his life to rescuing people and giving medical aid, and hold views which are just not bearable and cannot be expressed today. So it's a very interesting point, because it begs the question of, what is history good at? Well, history is very good at hindsight. This is a question you raised early on, Kisa. Why history? Well, history enables us to see some of the inherent contradictions and complexities in the humanitarian project. But those contradictions and complexities, we may perceive them to be double thinking or perhaps hypocrisy for people of the past. They're much harder to see for ourselves. So I think historical gaze should, historical consideration should give us a lot of humility in relation to our own contradictions, especially in relation to our contradiction and contradictory attitudes towards unequal distribution of power, wealth, and voice. Now, however, I say that we need to be wary of not replicating colonial fantasies. And I think we need to be wary in a sense that if we think of the globe as the old colonial maps colored in pink for the British Empire, etc., there is a tendency today to imagine humanitarian aid as still being completely bound by this north-south, this imposed universalism originating in the north, imposed on the rest of the world. I'd like to challenge that. So the first point to make is that humanitarianism, the second source of humanitarianism in the history of humanitarianism is, of course, the humanitarianism of war, the Geneva Convention, the Red Cross movement, as it was conceived. And that was not aimed at the colonial empires. That was not part of a colonial project. In fact, it was a domestic agenda. And humanitarian aid today, we've seen it during the COVID-19 crisis, may also be about crisis at home, inequalities in relation to the epidemic, inequalities in relation to life chances in our domestic environment. And that's also humanitarianism. We find that major NGOs like international organizations like Save the Children in the interwar had a very strong domestic agenda. You find that MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, in the 1980s and today have a domestic agenda. In other words, there is an MSF France. There is a strong mission in relation to issues that are taking place at home. I mean, MSF, for example, in COVID-19 was very much involved with issues linked to retirement homes and the epidemic. And that's very domestic. So in other words, not every internationalism is, not every humanitarianism is internationalist, and not every humanitarianism has been expressed in a colonial setting. A second point that I want to make from there, and it's a significant one, is that we who write the history of humanitarianism have to be quite careful not to replicate these North-South narratives. And one, so I want to give a few caveats. So one is that, of course, in this humanitarianism of war, in this humanitarianism of international aid, you find that, for example, the Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey today, India, were involved in humanitarian fundraising in the 1870s. That you find that the Japanese created the largest Red Cross movement in the early 20th century. The Chinese, building on their own traditions, not necessarily entirely borrowing, if you want, any kind of sacred text from Geneva, but building on their own traditions, developed forms of humanitarianism. Now, their history is being written. A lot of scholarship is now coming up. And that scholarship shows that we shouldn't take a Eurocentric perspective, and that, in effect, we should provincialize humanitarianism. International humanitarian aid funded by large NGOs is actually peanuts. It's very small. It's significant. It's emotionally very meaningful, and it's certainly very valuable, but it is not a very large amount of money. And a lot of other things are happening which follow different paths and which, of course, are more complex. So a point I want to make next is that decolonization, that is the collapse of colonial empires, has been central to the history of modern humanitarianism. And therefore, there is an interesting track. Arua pointed out that colonial empires and there is a sort of follow-up from colonialism, and that in effect, the missionaries that had been settled in the British empires were still there in Biafra and still served as a conduit between North and South. But I would say the conduit can be more complex than that. And I found a lot of evidence that, for example, actors from the South, Indians in the 1950s, Africans in the 1970s and 80s actually raised the profile of their cause in the United Kingdom, in other countries of the world, used the diaspora, used remittances, used churches to actually develop indigenous forms of humanitarianism, calling in on a case-by-case whatever relief or support they could actually muster. But in other words, the agency of the beneficiaries is extremely important. It's actually hidden because it's not the master narrative, but it is actually very significant, and it challenges us to think in a slightly more complicated way about how international relations happen at a human level. And I think for me, that's a very important point, because it shows that from the 60s, 70s onwards, humanitarians following from the missionaries, following from other internationalists, often took an anti-colonial perspective. So even though some, arguably, some big NGOs were very involved in colonialism in the 1940s and 50s, but by the late 50s onwards, you do find a lot of anti-colonial voices through humanitarian organizations, and that carries on up to now. Now, we ask for a historical perspective. Of course, it leaves a number of problems, a whole number of issues, notably this notion that even if the Biafrans used the sufferings of the Biafran children to raise, for example, the profile of their cause abroad, that image by itself has had a life of its own, and that image has generated the myth of the white savior. And this kind of has comforted, if you want, pre-existing racist perspectives on the global South. There's no doubt in my mind that this is true. There's no doubt in my mind that you can be a great humanitarian in terms of the work one does and simultaneously be a poor human being, or indeed a very repugnant human being in some other respects. Classic examples include, for example, Jan Smoot, the architect of the apartheid, or one of the architects of the apartheid, who was simultaneously also a great internationalist. How do we compute? How do we agree with these things? How do we understand these things? I think we need to be humble and realize that we probably carry similar contradictions that will come visible to what E.P. Thompson called the great condescension of posterity. So my image to finish is this one, Kisa. So I've shown it to you before, but it's a very, many of you who are international or work in international domain will have seen something like this. It is my little vaccination record and passport. And I'm saying this is an interesting symbol because, of course, I have my lovely, because I live in England, one of the few benefits is that I've got my full COVID-19 vaccine. And I want to show that this is actually an interesting product for the history of humanitarianism, because of course, a lot of the vaccines, a lot of the research in non-Western diseases, or diseases that used to be less frequent in the West, began in earnest during the colonial period. A lot of this work in so-called neglected diseases actually took place in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. In fact, much of that work was then neglected for a long time and is now being re-energized by consortiums such as the NDI and other groups. So I'm quite interested in this, the fact that we are holding on to vaccines as a passport to travel the world, but it's a passport that's not distributed everywhere to everyone. And it's a symbol, in my view, of some of the complexities of this history and of the current inequalities. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. There are so many points, and I hope we have sufficient time to touch all of them. In the meantime, I would like to encourage the audience to ask questions. I would like to start with the point of imagery, because Arua also mentioned that, and the contradictions that comes along with, on one hand, trying to raise humanity and maybe the danger of enforcing this white savior complex. And I would like to connect that with the current anti-racist movement. That's also, I think, one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today. We just heard an historic perspective, and I'll start with you, Bertrand. How do you look at this current anti-racism wave? Do you see any advantages for people working in the humanitarian field? Is there any opportunity that you see from this wave?
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting, we're in an interesting moment of civil rights and the reimagining of where race questions have been embedded in society. And I wouldn't say it's the first time, okay? I think it's very important that we go back to some, and the Americans in many ways have shown, have been at the forefront of it, that because of their slave-owning society past. But it's important to look at people like Du Bois, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, actually making Pan-Africanist demonstrations, if you want, at the time of the Versailles Treaty, seeing volunteers in the Spanish Civil War who then became figureheads of the civil rights movement in North America. So in other words, I think I don't think it's an accident that this conversation is taking place today, because I think there has been a lot of historically there's a long and I would say important tradition of civil rights and race issues being debated and being at the core of what it means to be a humanitarian in the history of humanitarianism. So that's so sorry, it's a long-winded way of putting it, but I do think this conversation is timely. I think it is important to think about where the racial discourses came from, when they were scientifically quote unquote articulated in the 19th century as part of a colonial project. So it's completely bound together, and it's I think I think we are living through an epistemic shift, a moment where we're changing the parameters of society. It's not the only one. I think there's another one about gender going on simultaneously, and those two epistemic shifts are ongoing at the moment, and I think are transformative in the way we conceive of ourselves, let alone others.
Yes, in your answer, I also see the beauty of an historian, because you're actually saying it's a continuity and that there's nothing new under the sun. I'm curious to hear, Arua, would you maybe, the point that Bertrand just shared with us about an ongoing struggle for decolonization and shifting the way we look at one another. Do you see the current anti-racism wave? To which extent is that new, actually, this whole wave of decolonization and anti-racism, Arua?
Well, thank you very much. I think what is going on, as Bertrand said, is not necessarily new. It's been a movement that has been going on. You know, I think what I think is more interesting about it now is that, you know, when you see people march out to protest against some issues in society, you see both white and black. You see different colors, you see different groups, you know, and that's what I find very interesting about it. So it's not necessarily about a particular group, you know, making a case for whatever they consider as injustice in a system, you know, but other groups, you see other groups, people from different racial backgrounds, you know, participating in what they consider as, you know, as an injustice in a system. So I think it's been going on. I think that what I think is a bit different now is the kind of, the level of involvement people, you know, from other backgrounds, you know, taking part, active part in, you know, speaking against what they consider as, you know, a social injustice, you know, in society. Because in the past, in the 60s, you know, it wasn't common to see whites, you know, coming up to say, this is not good. I mean, there was that, you know, there was that gap, you know, that gap was a bit, you know, wide, you know, but now you can see somebody, you can see a white taking a lead saying, this is not good, and it's not about, you know, sycophancy or hypocrisy. The person means it because of a kind of a new understanding, I should say, you know, or the level of awareness among people that, okay, having interacted with all races, all groups, you now know that, I mean, what has been there as a colonial view, a colonial notion about a particular group is a social construct. There's nothing biological about it. And so what is not good is not good. What is against humanity is against humanity, regardless of who is involved. But that was not the situation in the past. And in the past, okay, it would have been very risky for a core white person to, support, come out openly to support what may be considered an agenda, against a particular group. But, I see a kind of shift and a new understanding, awareness among people across the globe.
Thank you for that point. It makes me think about the American writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, who also made a difference about solidarity between the age of his father and his age, actually pointing the point that you make, Arua, that now various people, white and black, coming together. So there is some incremental change. I would like to discuss skepticism in two ways. One, in the point that Bertrand made about challenging ourselves to look beyond the North and South narrative and actually taking a critical approach to what we might call now as a decolonial agenda. Bertrand, I'd like to start with that concept, decolonization, because it's quite a big term and it's being used also in this webinar. Frantz Fanon, who wrote this authoritative book, The Wretched of the Earth, in '61, actually says decolonization is a violent process, because someone in a position of power would not give power without being challenged, without any pressure. And I want to build on the point that Arua made, that there are some shift, and you see that organizations, humanitarian development organization, making big statements about decolonization. And on the other side, you see activists who are quite skeptic, because they say, how can one decolonize without feeling any kind of pain? So there is some form of skepticism. So that's the question. How would you define this concept, and how do you look to those skeptic voices?
Okay, it's a very rich point, actually. So the first one to make is Frantz Fanon was writing as a member of the FLN as part of an armed struggle in the war of Algerian independence. So, and Frantz Fanon's previous book had been based on his psychiatrist experience in the colonial setting. So, and this is really important, because Frantz Fanon's point is that, of course, colonialism is not simply a system of governance; it's also a system of knowledge production. And that in his case, as a psychiatrist coming from the West Indies, working in Algeria, he could witness, if you want, colonialism as expressed through mental health issues and the damage it did to a whole society and to individuals in particular. So in a sense, he had a very profound, his view of colonialism was very profound, that it affected the mind, the body, the culture, every aspect of the colonial subjects in the system. And therefore, to free oneself, and he is very much aligned to existentialism, to free oneself was not simply a matter of acquiring a flag and a government. It was actually about transforming radically everything about the relationship between individuals within a territory. So I think that in my view, this is where Frantz Fanon is profoundly.
So we are talking about a different context, I understand.
It's a different context, but it's also it shows in Frantz Fanon's work, you see that how decolonization is much more than political enfranchisement or political autonomy. It is about a very profound philosophical shift, and I think obviously that's painful, even at an individual level. Now, I don't subscribe to Frantz Fanon's more, to his apology of violence, because there is an element of Frantz Fanon that actually, and of many revolutionary movements of the 60s that promote the virtues of violence. I'm personally don't subscribe to any of that, but it's important to remember that in the 60s, a lot of decolonization took place through an armed struggle of liberation. And that's very important to remember. Now we're past, these countries exist. The decolonization formal process has happened, at least over there. Now, the question that you ask is whether it's happened over here. in the countries we both inhabit in the north of Europe. And there, the question I think is much more is a very contested point, and there is a battle, and it's called it takes different shapes, but sort of culture war is ongoing, and it's waged by different parties. I'm disappointed by the tenor of it, in a sense that I believe that colonialism is a fact. It's not a matter of interpretation. The damage it did is also factual. There are bodies buried. We know where they are. So it's not a matter of dispute that we need to rethink the past and confront it. And
I would like to sharpen my question, Bertrand. Sorry for breaking in, given the time.
Yeah, no,
I want the audience to understand what we are actually talking about when we talk about colonialism. I like how you explain in the context in which Fanon operated. When now aid organizations say that they need to decolonize, the skeptic asks, is one in position of power able to colonize? Because the fear is that by using these kind of terms, a struggle can be hijacked or co-opted. So the question is actually, our organization, because you know international organization very well, can someone in a position of power take the colonial process?
Well, I think people can make an effort in making access to positions of power within the organization, making sure that the flow of information and responsibility comes from every direction. There is not simply a north-south. I think that's happening. It's already happening in many organizations. And what's happening as well is that internationalism is very much south-south, and arguably always was. And that's something that is now more visible and should be more openly declared. And I think so these things are happening. Now, whether it goes as far as the full Fanonian reinventing of the self, that's going to be the work of 2 generations, not one. It's going to take a long time. But I think there is a process that's been launched. I do believe that things are on there. We are changing, and things will be changing continuously. And I think that's the moment we're at, is this realization that colonialism is not simply about, or decolonization is not simply about political factors. It's also about how power is lived.
Exactly. Maybe Arua, could you reflect on that? Because you said people are now honestly anti-racist. It's not some kind of hypocrisy, it's an honest belief. Would you reflect, would you look at the perspective of skeptic who says organizations now talk about decolonization because it's some form of public relations. It's in order to be part of a movement and not as an actual effort to do what they claim to do, actually shifting the power.
This question about decolonization of aid is a very interesting one. In 1968, there was an article a lady wrote entitled, "Are We Colonial?" And the lady who wrote the article, Mary Well, was a part of the humanitarian effort in Biafra. When I saw that article and what we are discussing today, I was very, very excited, because there's something that going on during the humanitarian from the north to the south, okay? Europe, North America to Biafra, and then the people who managed, all the missionaries, the Red Cross, and other groups, from the north. And what the lady observed in that article, was that very often she noted people, the humanitarian officials,
We are having a problem with the connection, Arua. Arua, maybe you could switch off your video because of the connection. In the meantime, I have a question. I see some questions coming in Q&A. Thea, are you with us?
I'm here.
You know, for instance, there was something she mentioned.
Bertrand, your connection was very bad.
About, you know, giving.
Arua, you're breaking down. Your link is, your line is breaking down. Sorry.
If you
Is it still like that?
If you could switch your video. In the meantime, I'll give Thea the opportunity first to reflect on what has been said, especially my question on the skeptic side and the critical reflection on colonialism, and maybe we have some interesting questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Giza. On the septic side, I'm thinking about it deeply because there are so many things to say about it. Because superficially, yes, you're right, of course. I mean, the more things change, the less they change. And we see all these international agencies struggling to redefine their roles. But at the same time, we also see them often reacting in a very defensive way. For example, there is the localization debate, and it's very clear aid will be localized. But I hear so many people doubt the project and say, oh, but the capacities are not yet in order, etc., etc., etc. So we see that resistance or mindsets that go against these kind of things. Yet I'm not so skeptical. First, I think, and I think maybe if that's what you mean, I would fully agree, the voices become so much clearer from different corners that those head of agencies, the Geneva-based folks, have less and less to say. And what is humanitarianism is being debated in many spaces and many platforms today, and not just at the meeting rooms in Geneva and New York. And it's a very positive development. And I can tell you for sure that during the preparations of the World Humanitarian Summit, the first ideas for the summit that emanated from the donors from Geneva, from New York, had to radically hold over after a long series of discussions in different spaces in the world. And it was really significant. As well, you cannot just pretend to change your practices all the time, because people start to believe it and people start to act differently. So I do believe that this type of change, especially when it is fired up from below, is going to happen. At the same time, I also wonder, like many people I see here in the Q&A, in the chat,
Yes,
that they talk about, we talk about colonialism, and I'm sure it's important. Although I must share that the first time that I noticed that many people now started to talk again about decolonization, I was a bit surprised. I thought, why would that be the organizing concept of what we are seeing going wrong in the world? Is it not capitalism, the destruction of the planet? I mean, those kind of things, a lack of solidarity. So to me, rather than, Bertrand said it's a fact colonization, but to me, it's also a rather vague concept to organize around. But on the other hand, if I see who is organizing around the concept, it is about those questions. It is about capitalism. It is about climate, maybe not always in a similar way. It is about solidarity. It's about racism. It's about discrimination. And those are super significant items that all come together, it seems, at the moment in different spaces. And one just hopes, because I really think all these people in the Q&A, they really keep going about the economic organization, economic global organization, market working, etc., where we couldn't forget that humanitarianism has always one of the histories of humanitarianism, of course, is in Christian charity, where inequality was completely acceptable. Yet you would have to give some little money every Sunday after you come back from church to the poor beggars who cannot survive in the system. So this type of accepting inequality has been one of
entrenched
the
with humanitarianism. Is that
exactly,
also
exactly.
some? Could I also present that to other panelists? Is that some kind of summary of what is going on in the Q&A? And I'm curious to hear Bertrand thoughts on that, the point of power relations, and to which extent development or humanitarian efforts are outside these questions of these big questions that characterize the world order at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I meant when I said that humanitarianism had been a conservative ideology. It's not. It's not necessarily about the radical transformation. It's about making sure somebody doesn't die, and that's a very noble project. It's a very noble project, but it's, if you look at it from, say, a developmentalist perspective, you may say, well, what you need to do is, to paraphrase Oxfam in the 1970s, is not to give them a fish, but to give them a net. And of course, then you can ask the question about, the overfishing that may take place as a result of too many nets. But that's the fundamental. There's a fundamental difference in approach there, and that humanitarian, a lot of humanitarian aid accepts situations and accepts wars, for instance, intervenes in wars in order to make the consequences of wars less awful, but does not really promote a pacifist message. And I think that's the fundamental stance of humanitarianism. I think we've got to recognize, of course, that it's a small gesture. The scale of the budget of international humanitarian aid, as analyzed by Al-Nap, is minuscule if you put it in relation to the arms trade. It's minuscule if you put it in relation to development. So it's a form of internationalism. It's a form of expression of solidarity. It's not the full spectrum, and it has limited achievements. Now, when you've accepted all of those premises, then the question is: are we going to throw the baby with the bathwater? Are we going to actually get rid of what makes humanitarianism so valuable if we transform radically the way we do it? And that is the question that people are afraid of. They're notably, I think, very afraid that there is an anti-internationalism, which, in the name of saying don't patronize, having states from the South or from anywhere saying respect my sovereignty, don't patronize me, don't intervene in my sphere, don't criticize what I do. And that is actually, and that conversely, the reformed humanitarians of the North might actually feel so concerned about appearing post-colonial or colonial in approach that they might then silence themselves. Yeah, I think that is actually, this is very crudely put, but I think it's a false dichotomy. I think it's an imaginary dichotomy. I think we can still, and we should still, call abuses to light. We should bring those issues. So humanitarianism is still there in its denunciatory position, and it doesn't mean that we cannot change the way we do things, even if there are issues of logistics, etc. But the reality at the moment is that the localization project is stalling. Actually, Thea, I think I'm worried that it isn't moving forward. So if you're thinking about things, I'm a bit anxious about that part of the project.
Yeah, I wonder, Bertrand. So throwing the baby with the bathwater. Before I give Arua also the floor to ask the quite bold question that I'm about to ask. Does a decolonial agenda also mean that organizations should abolish themselves in order to work in a way that deals with the power relations that have been described?
Okay, that's an interesting point. That makes the assumption that they would make a difference if they abolish themselves. I'm not sure it would. I think it's interesting. If you abolish tomorrow Médecins Sans Frontières, if you abolish Save the Children, what would you achieve by abolishing this? I think it would be very counterproductive, because in effect they do deliver services in places other people don't want to be or don't want to deliver services. So those services would disappear. Would they be replaced by something else from abroad? Probably not. Would they be replaced by something else from within? That's an interesting question. And maybe in some cases, Médecins Sans Frontières or NGOs have given states the opportunity not to invest in medicine or schools. I've given them the right to spend their money in a different way, and perhaps by withdrawing. But that's a big test to make for the people who are the receiving end. I think testing that proposition implies that we are going to do a sort of neoliberal experiment in the agency of states. I'm highly skeptical that we would get good results. So there you are. I mean, this is why I think.
Yeah, it is. There were some thoughts behind the question, because one could say maybe the current model is not working, and organizations should reflect about how they can be part of a movement that fight against power and injustice, and not thinking in terms of development or humanitarianism. But I'm curious to hear what Arua think, because Arua, can we hear you now?
Yeah.
First, I wondered on the point on public relations, the question whether decolonization can be hijacked by people in position of power for their image, and the point that has been made about how would a new decolonial agenda look like?
Yeah, I think the question of decolonization should be handled carefully, because yes, people want a kind of change of attitude, because in humanitarian organizations, maybe a certain group of people have permanently been in charge, and the structure has remained the same for maybe decades. And maybe some people feel it's a kind of closed system that is reserved, for a particular group of people. But then we should be careful, because there's something Bertrand mentioned about the North and the South North and South relationship. And the issue is that, hello?
We hear
yes,
you.
we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me? Okay. Yeah, the question is, now there's a structure. You have actors. I know, when you talk about, decolonization, there are some things that come to mind. You talk about, the agents, the actors in the system, in the humanitarian, services. You talk about power relations and the practice. So are we looking at, decolonization in terms of changing those who are in the field, those who have been in the system? Are we talking about decolonization in terms of power relations or in terms of practice? So these are the things we have to, have in mind, because some would want decolonization in terms of, maybe the actors, a certain group of people have been in the leadership.
We can't hear you now again, Bertrand. Sorry, I mean Arua. Bertrand, I'd like to come back to you, because given the time, you made some very important points, and we have not really had the opportunity to really reflect on them. We have around 15 minutes before we wrap up. The point about not all humanitarianism is colonial, and the importance of looking at the diversity. By giving this historic perspective for people here after this conference, when they go home and they want to work on a decolonial international aid, what would you like to give them with that message? Why is that important for them to take that? Why is it important for them to be critical about how we are having a conversation now on the decolonization of international aid?
I think I think there's a mirror or potentially an illusion in some of the more extreme forms of the conversation about the decolonization. Let's not exaggerate ourselves. In other words, when you denounce the white savior syndrome, are you not in effect reinforcing it rather than dismantling it? If you look at the complexity of the history of humanitarian aid, you realize that it's very difficult to generalize in the way that we've just done, actually, and that we simplified things enormously. If we look at what actually takes place, there's a lot more complex relationships. There are human beings who are, some of them were profoundly anti-colonial or anti-racist. Others were racist, working towards similar aims and sometimes delivering similar goods. Now, the goods themselves may have a moral value in their own right. So let's be nuanced. Let's be careful in our investigation of the past and understand the complexities of it. Now, the point I wanted to make about humanitarianism not being purely colonial is that even though it has a very strong colonial inheritance, it also has a very strong domestic history, and it relates also to our societies. And some of our colonial present is actually in our cities. It's around us. You know, you don't need to take a plane to encounter it. It's around you, and I think that sometimes by casting, if you want, tarring humanitarian aid as being uniquely post-colonial, we're just forgetting what else is going on, which is much more mundane and around us, which can be addressed much more politically, domestically. And I think that's very, so therefore the two things, this is what I want to keep in mind. Let's not oversimplify. Let's not think that humanitarianism has more power than it has, because humanitarian aid is only a small portion of international relations. It has flaws and vices like every other form of human activity, but it is not inherently flawed and vicious in my view. And I think that's something I'd like to defend, because I think in many ways, ultimately, the aim of saving one life anywhere is worth fighting for.
Exactly. And maybe, Bertrand, for the audience, I don't know if they have this point already. Could you elaborate on also another danger of the current anti-racist or decolonial movement, why you actually fear that it could be hijacked or misused by illiberal forces? Could you elaborate for the audience what, maybe with some examples, what some kind of dangers that you observe?
I think that we're living in an interesting time for liberalism, the collapse of liberalism potentially. And I think it's very clear that humanitarianism, unlike, say, socialist solidarity, which also existed in the 20th century, took a liberal form. And it's very, I think it's very interesting when you see some states using either the language of sovereignty or the language of anti-racism to essentially deflect any criticism of their practices. And those practices can be of a genocidal nature, or can be of an extremely violent nature. And we can look around the world and find many examples of this. There was a profound irony in the fact that the World Humanitarian Summit, organized by the United Nations, took place in Istanbul, just on the eve of the regime taking a very, very authoritarian shape. I don't think I'm being particularly contentious in saying that. And I think you can see then how, in the guise of saying, well, let's challenge, if you want, the North-South relationship, which I think is a worthwhile endeavor, you can find actually different forms of power, different forms of exercise of naked land grabbing or ambition being promoted as an alternative to traditional northern forms of humanitarianism. And I think that there's danger in that for the receivers of that aid, and there is a profound ambiguity, to put it mildly, about the nature of that project.
one of the participants asked whether there is some research done in this field, whether you have some recommendations.
Oh, sorry.
That is Somaye Dehban, but maybe that's something we can answer later.
There's an awful lot of research being done. This is the beauty of I'll do another plug, which is for the International Humanitarian Studies Association, which Tia is the president of, and that is we are in a golden age of study of humanitarianism. There's never been so much scholarship, historical and other scholarships. So yes, the answer is probably there is somebody very good working on this topic. I will need to identify who that is, but
yes, and I hope after today that people are also encouraged, based on the question that we have discussed, maybe quite a nuance, but it's my task as a host to present as bold statement as possible.
Can I do another plug, sir?
Yes, please.
There is a book that on liberalism that's just coming out that I co-edited with colleagues from Save the Children, including Giuliano Fiori, and the book is called Amidst the Debris, and it's coming out with Hearst in a month. So that will be, and there's some really important text within it. I think you will find, for example, the work of Mark Duffield of particular significance. So so thank you very much for allowing me to do another plug. I don't make money out of it. I reassure.
Thank you for that, Bertrand. I hope Somaya is happy with the answer. And also an encouragement for people who want to do research, as you mentioned. So absolutely. Thea, we are going towards the end. First, I'm curious whether there are some points that you'd like to reflect something that we have forgotten from the Q&A. Before I give Bertrand the opportunity to give a last reflection and then end with you. For the audience, we have lost Arua because of the connection, but hopefully he will be here within 12 minutes. Otherwise, we are still grateful for his participation. Thea.
Yeah, thanks, Kisa. A few things. First, I wanted to say that with all the respect of how wonderful our discussion is among the panelists, the discussion in the chat is just equally interesting, and has a life of its own, people reacting to each other. So I really sincerely hope that we can also preserve the chats here, because there's another panel going on in the chats, which is really, really interesting. And thanks everybody for being so committed and so engaged and writing so it's lovely, it's wonderful. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other one is that there's another aspect to what Bertrand, and I know you feel the same, but just to mention, it's not just Southern governments deflecting criticism today using decolonization, but I fear it's also working through in our society, in the Netherlands, other places where the solidarity with people who really need it is eroding very quickly, and somehow riding on a sentiment that we don't need to extend solidarity anymore to people from other spaces and other places. And we see that happening very quickly in our own societies. And that is equally worrisome. So I'm always torn between seeing humanitarianism as rather a narrow objective of just saving lives so that people don't fall off, whereas accepting all the inequalities that we have in the world, which is a negative image, to seeing them as heroes that at least without the solidarity of extending and saving lives would cost a lot of lives. And taking out humanitarianism from the equation often leads to abandonment. Nothing comes in its place. So that's a very difficult dilemma. And I really appreciated Bertrand's remark that history helps us to understand that we are also full of contradictions, and I see them every day. Now, my other point here I wanted to make, just to make it more complicated, we seem to make humanitarianism here as a sort of part pro toto for all the social movements that we have in the world, but that's very untrue. In my own institute, in the Institute of Social Studies, I'm one of the few, one or two, that works on humanitarian studies. And most people find me super conservative for working on humanitarianism, and they're all engaging with a whole range of other movements, the climate, labor movements, what have you, anti-capitalist movements. So one of the ways out, I feel, always for humanitarianism, if the gates could be a bit more open and seriously consider whether there's not more to be found in joining efforts with other movements at the level of advocacy, in looking at the experiences with participation, accountability in other sectors of development, for example, where discussions have been going on for a longer period of time than in humanitarianism. And I think there's much to gain there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thea, before I come back to you to share with us what we have learned today and finish this conversation, I would like, I see some very interesting questions in the chat. So now now I'm a bit confused, but I'd like to present one from Anna-Marie Hemskerk, Bertrand. Should he talk about reparations instead of aid?
That's an entirely different political conversation, in a sense, and I think aid is what people do to each other. Reparation is what states might do to other states, or societies might do to societies. And I think I think again, we fall in the trap of thinking that humanitarianism is only what big NGOs do. And of course it isn't. A lot of humanitarian aid is done by very small groups in a synagogue, in a mosque, in a church, and a lot of the money that was collected during Ramadan, for example, just now. And by the way, Eid Mubarak to those who have seen the moon yesterday, because it will be Eid tonight for some of you. I think it would be for those groups. It's a spontaneous act of solidarity. Now, the interesting point, of course, is who mediates the solidarity and how is that solidarity socially constructed, and whether humanitarian organizations are up to the task of mobilizing. And I think it's clear that they are to a degree, but they're also not able to mobilize in a very systematic way. And sometimes some of that mobilization fails. I'm shocked and horrified, like most of you, I suspect, about how rescue at sea is represented, how refugee camps in Greece is represented, how Europe has constructed itself as a political fortress, a border fortress, which with no concern for some of the horrific conditions. And somebody pointed out, I think it's Murty, the appalling conditions that are currently experienced in some of the Greek refugee camps. It's very, very striking when you compare and contrast with the past. And I made, this is just to conclude, but this is kind of, it shocked me, so I'm still telling the anecdote. But I presented with a colleague to students of the university, not my students, but other students, students from the street, if you want. And a compare and contrast our social response to the refugee crisis, which, I mean, I don't want to unpack this, but refugee crisis today, and compare and contrasted it to the reception of the boat people in the 1980s in Europe. And one of the students looked at us and said very coldly, they must have been mad. So his perspective was that the people of the past in the 1980s, by opening the doors to both people, ideological refugees in a very specific context of the Cold War, basically had committed a kind of crime. They had just opened the door to diversity in a way that was uncontrolled. I was absolutely appalled by it. I was very shocked, but it also made me think that I did live in a very isolated bubble, and I needed to work on that. But yeah, that's something that was a few years back. But I think we have a problem. We have a problem today, and I think to talk about decolonizing the humanitarian project entails other alliances. I think Thea is absolutely correct, because there are other forces at work, and I do believe still in the sanctity of life and humanity. And I do believe that the Humanitarian project is in of itself worth fighting for.
So it's not, we should be careful with throwing the baby with the bathwater. Thank you very much, Bertrand, for that. Arua, for you, you have been gone for a while because of some connections problem. Please, very short, because we have 4 minutes left. Do you have a message that you would like us to take home?
Yeah, I think this question of decolonization shouldn't be seen in terms of what, you know, the actors, I mean the agents in the field do, you know, in terms of maybe their practice, their organization, their leadership, and all that. We should also look at what recipients are expected to do, because if you are talking about decolonization, I think the recipients also should have a role to play in terms of that should also be decolonized, you know, in a way, because there's something that is, I noticed that is common in among people who receive aid, you know, from the North. They receive and then they continue to receive and continue to receive. And there's no effort, you know, to do something for themselves. And I think this is a problem, this dependency issue, you know, among recipients, you know, who keep receiving. So when we talk about decolonization, I mean, we should also think about what is expected of, you know, the recipients of, you know, aid. There should also be an attempt to decolonize their attitude so that you don't continue to depend on somebody and, you know, waiting for somebody to give you. You should also help yourself. And I think, you know, when you give aid, there should be effort to make those who receive aid to start, you know, depending on themselves. For example, in Biafra, you know, AIDS, you know, came in, and then people were also made to engage in talk after the war. You know, people could easily switch. You know, organization should also be considered in terms of both those who give aid and those who receive aid.
Yes, that's a very clear point, and also related to the point of agency that Bertrand mentioned. We have 2 minutes left. So for people who we will give you the opportunity to read the summary of this event, and this will also record it. So I'll talk about that later on. Thea, very short, what have we learned? Because we have 1 minute left.
Well, what I've learned mainly is that this is the beginning of a conversation that has to continue, and it's very rich discussion. Yeah.
That's a very short summary.
It is as short as it is, because it is, I mean, I couldn't do justice to the discussion by trying to summarize it in a sentence or so. So I really feel people should look at the chats, people should look at the recording, and we just continue. I hope many people come back for the next session.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for participating. It was an honor. I learned a lot. I would like to ask Kim to share the screen for the next sessions, because as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a series. So today I learned about the importance of looking at power structure from a colonial perspective and the humanitarianism. At the same time, I learned that humanitarianism is indeed, in a way, entrenched with the colonial project, but humanitarianism is not colonial in itself. And also the importance of being very critical when we use words such as decolonization, and also reflect about our own practices. The point that has been made to look at, for instance, the perspective of the recipient, all these points will come the next seminar that you can see here. The next one is on June the 2nd on the development aid perspective, and after that on the humanitarian perspective. I see that we have the donor perspective, and hopefully we will also reflect on the role of the recipient. I would like to thank Partos, KUNO, the International Institute for Social Studies, for organizing this. And of course, I would like to thank the participants and obviously the panelists. Thank you very much, and see you next time.